Hello my friends, Stucker here, and welcome back to another Alternate History Hearts of Iron 4 video. I screwed up. I know. As I'm sure all of you are aware by now, the way things work for our alternate history videos is that we take the top liked suggestions from our previous videos, the comments that you all put in the comment section, and then we put that into a poll in order to determine what the next video is. Somehow I copied the same answer twice. I don't know why it happened. I think that the whole thing happened because at the time I was doing this, I was trying to mess around with the poll settings because it appears that YouTube has an update where instead of 5 options, it's now 4 options. And it literally does not give me an option to put a 5th alternative option. So yeah, now instead of top 5, the polls are going to be top 4, but there's literally nothing I can do about that. Anyway, despite these issues that I've had, the top voted suggestion was easily, what if Franz Ferdinand wasn't assassinated? And that's top one, even if you count the fact that the one I repeated twice here actually ended up only being 39% combined. Still 45% of you wanted to know what would happen. Well, the answer, my friends, is fascinating, so let's dive into it. To that end, in order to be able to explain this, we're going to need to use the Great War Redux mod, the World War I mod in which, well, everything is pain and suffering, but the men have fantastic facial hair. Speaking of which, Austria-Hungary. As I'm sure all of you are already aware, the thing that would end up triggering World War I in the first place was the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was the presumptive heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary. And after his assassination, Austria-Hungary would then go and send a ultimatum to Serbia, just a whole bunch of demands that were pretty much designed to be refused in the first place, so that they would then have justification to go and invade after all the trouble they'd had in the Balkans for years. Serbia was of course backed by Russia, Russia was allied with France, and so upon Austria declaring war on Serbia, which triggered a war with Russia, Germany supported Austria, and from that, World War I kicks off. Which that then brings us to our scenario. What would have happened if he hadn't been assassinated? Would World War I have even happened in the first place? Yeah, it probably would have. But things would have looked a little bit different here, and we're going to need to explain things. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive into this now, shall we? Also, hey my friends, side note, a little bit of an interjection here. If you want to go ahead and support the channel, not only can you help by commenting, and subscribing, but simultaneously, if you really want to help, you can go and buy my merch. I actually just launched this here, and there's a bunch of fun shirts, such as my katana shirts, which you see me wearing here now. Also, if you want to go on an adventure with me here this next year, I just launched a trip to Mongolia, and there's only 5 early bird spots left at the time that I'm making this video now. Early bird spots get a $100 discount, so make sure to go ahead and sign up, and let's go have some fun together. Anyway, going back into things. From the beginning of the game here, in May of 1910, tensions have been building all over Europe. Of course, the process that would lead to World War I was a series of different tension-building events that would ultimately culminate in World War I itself. So to say that Archduke Franz Ferdinand's assassination was the cause of World War I is accurate, but simultaneously it wasn't the only thing. These tensions had been there for a while, and pretty much every power in here was looking for an excuse to just light the fuse. Honestly, the trigger could have been anything at that point. The question then is, how do we get there? So if Ferdinand does not get assassinated, that's going to present us with a series of questions of what happens next, but in order to be able to reach that point, we have to first address how it is that he can even survive in the first place. Unlike a lot of scenarios that I usually do on here, there isn't actually much that I really have to change. Austria-Hungary is going to have basically the same path that it does in the historical timeline. The only real difference that we're going to say then is that it actually has better control over the varying different ethnicities within the empire, the thing that would actually prove to be Austria's undoing as time went on. You can see right here when we go to the national ideas of the nation that Austria-Hungary, well, the majority of these are very dangerous. Very dangerous and bad indeed. Among all the great powers in Europe, easily the ones that are in the weakest position, arguably, are Austria-Hungary and Russia, both with very tentative controls over their population, even under their absolute monarchies, and lots of resentment that is building underneath the surface. Or I say under the surface, a lot of it is quite outspoken in just how unhappy people are. Austria-Hungary is a multi-ethnic nation, and by multi-ethnic, I mean that it is composed of dozens of different nationalities of people, of which the 2 largest, arguably, or at least most influential, are the Austrian-German population and the Hungarian population, which, from these 2 things, back in the previous century, in the 19th century, we had a whole revolution that could have resulted in an independent Hungary, but instead resulted in a compromise between Austria and Hungary, which would create the dual monarchy, the system in which they, technically speaking, are under the rule of one emperor, but have 2 separate legislatures, and it's a very complicated issue. The biggest complication in this case, just as happened historically, is the issue with the Hungarians. In Hungary, a political crisis flared up after the expansion of voting rights in the kingdom. While the dual monarchy guarantees Hungary an equal status within the empire, there's still some Hungarian opposition present in our system regarding certain issues. Yes, many people when looking at history think that, oh, Austria dominated everything and was abusing all the different ethnicities within the empire. And yeah, to a degree, it was. But what many people completely neglect is that with the dual monarchy system, that Hungary over here, it arguably did just as much, if not more, within the empire in order to be able to abuse the varying different minorities within the country. Depending upon where you were, you pretty much had two options for your education and future. You either had to learn German or you had to learn Hungarian, and either one was going to be forced upon you depending upon what school you went to. Hungary was dominated by a Magyar aristocracy, which most certainly was not friendly to the common people, which in turn would create a lot of tension, particularly down here in the Balkans. Tension that over time would lead to many different assassination attempts upon Austrian and Hungarian officials, and would ultimately end up resulting in the assassination of Franz Ferdinand himself. So, in order for us to avoid that fate, arguably the thing that we would have to do is try to stabilize the situation more than what historically happened in our own timeline. If you go into the focus tree of Austria-Hungary itself, that is actually the majority of its politics tree, is you either have the focus on Hungarian politics and the thing within the Balkans, or you have the focus on Austrian politics and it's focused on the Italian as well as the Czech and Bohemian side of things. And so while pretty much all of this has to be done, there is one key area that we are going to say happens from the very beginning, that an intense focus is specifically put upon controlling things in the Balkans and focusing internally rather than externally. What I mean by that is that historically what happened is that Austria-Hungary, in an effort to stabilize itself, focused outward and specifically wanted to conquer and earn glory down here in the Balkans, competing with Russia in order to be able to sate the nobility within the country and simultaneously give people an outlet in conquering territories and increasing national strength, that this is something that would stabilize the empire. Instead, in this new timeline that we build, Austria-Hungary is going to focus on things more internally. While still friendly with Germany and trying to maintain relations and balance of power, they're not going to be as belligerent as they were in our own time. To that end, we're going to get some civilian factory construction here underway, and simultaneously after that, we are going to go ahead and maintain the Ostlik. Since 1867, Austria and Hungary have represented a united entity, one of the greatest powers in the world. We must mobilize efforts in stabilizing the empire and avoid internal dissension, which yes, this is going to give us political power, and it's going to unlock several decisions limiting minority activism, which is going to be a constant thorn in our side. With our very limited military factory capacity here, Austria-Hungary is most certainly not as strong as what you would see with Germany, which has many more factories, or France, or the United Kingdom. Hell, even Russia has a bigger military-industrial base, as in the case of Austria-Hungary, much of this is split between varying provinces and also concentrated within the Czech lands up here. To that end, what we're going to go ahead and do, we're going to stop production of howitzers because we don't need to focus on heavy artillery, and what we are going to say is that much of the military was standardized over this time. One of the key problems that Austria-Hungary had is that its lands were, well, we already talked about it, multi-ethnic, very divided, and the same thing applied to the military. Where is it? There it is, multi-ethnic army. Oh dear God, those are some very bad effects. The diversity of Austria-Hungary causes stark differences in the culture, training, and loyalty of the armed forces. This disorganization causes the ineffectiveness of our strike force. Yeah, it's not good. It's not good at all. What we can argue is that by focusing on things internally, this is something that actually increases the military capabilities of Austria-Hungary itself, even at the cost of, not actually looking to use said military externally. Instead, that better military service would do likely a better job maintaining order down here in the Balkans and fighting against terrorists. Yeah, see what I said about assassinations? Assassination attempt on Governor Marian Varasanin. Criminal Bodan Zaric, oh dear God, I'm gonna have so many problems with the names here, died today. The native of Bosnia was apprehended by the police when he had just committed an attempted murder against General Marian Varasanin, governor of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Before being immobilized, the separatist shot himself in the chest after missing the Bosnian general 5 times. His legendary vagueness spared great turmoil throughout the region. Yeah, Bosnia is a dangerous region. Yes, this is a constant issue that would have to be dealt with. You can see here right now that even at this point, the Slovak region is destabilizing. As all these different destabilizing events pop up, we are going to need to stop the activists that are trying to operate within the region. Again, we are saying that what Austria-Hungary does is it focuses more internally during this time period. Immediately after this, there's the question then of what to focus on. What would actually stabilize things faster? To focus on Hungary and the opposition within there, or to focus more on internal politics of Austria, and from that fix the varying different issues surrounding the heart of the state? Well, we have the focus tree that we have to beeline down here, which is end Slav opposition, which specifically allows us to fight against Serbian terrorists, which this is the focus that ultimately would lead to Franz Ferdinand surviving, if done early enough. The problem is that Austria did not focus nearly as much on the Balkans and actually maintaining order down there, instead trying to expand its influence outside of the country. But we can actually stop the assassination by doing this early enough in order to increase stability within the region. More attention is going to be placed in the Balkans, and from here we are going to wipe out the terrorists before it is that they have the option to be able to go and assassinate the Archduke. Well, since we're going to have to beeline down here in the first place, that means that the first thing that has to be done in order to be able to help the empire is focus on things internally, of which the thing that paralyzes the Austrian state is the Hungarian issue. So, first thing that is going to happen is specifically the Transylvanian politics. Hungary is the largest constituent of the empire as well as the first territory in terms of demography. However, Stephen's crown is plagued by many minorities that it's time to integrate. Yes. With this, we are also going to be getting our first political advisor, Paul Gosch von Frankenthalern, who is a professional crisis solver, a guy who would focus specifically on internal developments within the empire and try to fix it from within before focusing outward. We are not going to be placing hawks in charge nearly as much as what historically happened. Once that is done, we move on to Tisza's silent coup. The prime minister must direct the parliamentary structures towards unwavering support for the government. Mr. Tisza seemed perfectly aware that the Hungarian political life can be controlled with fine words and good accounts. Yes, because in the case of Hungary, it's not like a parliament of the people or anything. It is quite literally just another aristocracy. And controlling those nobles is going to be key to anything here. Along with these regular politics issues, one of the key things that's going to have to change is who's in charge of the military. Historically, one of the big influential figures was this guy, Franz Conrad von Hotzendorf, who you see here is an army offense specialist. And historically, he is a person who is a massive warhawk and was constantly pushing for war with Russia. He wanted to expand things. So in this case, we are going to sideline him, and instead of focusing on offense and conquest, we are going to focus on internal reform with Blaise von Schuma, or Shemua. God, I can't pronounce any of the names. Serbia lifts embargo. After realizing the absurdity of their sanctions, the Serbian representatives announced the lifting of total embargo imposed on us. As a result, we can establish a Austro-Hungarian-Serbian trade again. Ah, lovely. After integrating Slovakia, the next step after that is extinguish Romanian nationalism. The independence movements in Transylvania strongly limit the potential of the region. We must continue the ongoing integration and form a regional guard loyal to the regime. Yes, there were movements like this all along the border with varying different states and entities, and we do not want Romania to have a stronger presence in here once eventually war breaks out, because, well, my friends, that's still likely going to happen. Now, the Italians are getting all uppity here in Tyrol. Well, yep, we're going to move to stop that real quick. This is another thing that would end up proving to be a massive problem for the Austrians, and specifically the whole question over Tyrol, as well as Istria and other territory down here. This was a constant question of ownership between Austria-Hungary and Italy, which, technically speaking, nominally from the beginning, Germany, Austria, and Italy were allies. They were friends. But after a series of issues broke out between them, relations between Italy and Austria-Hungary would break down, and territory was desired from the Austrians, which would be one of the key deciding factors that made Italy go and side with France, and from there attack Austria, which would split Austria's attention when the war broke out. Theoretically, by focusing on things internally and maybe building better relations, maybe this doesn't happen. With that, the final step that we're going to have over here, at least for the immediate time being, is to promote Hungarian interests. In order to guarantee Hungary's unrestricted support, we must reinforce them in their position as the leader of the empire. Their benefits and rights must remain unchanged, and a status quo must prevail. With Hungarian interests promoted and internal political stability secured, this means that Austria at this point can largely focus on industrialization and integration of its varying different territories. That means, my friends, industrial expansion. Since the beginning of the century, the empire has experienced a series of labor and industrial reforms that have led to numerous investments. The effects of this policy are felt and allow a notable expansion of civilian industry. Yes, Austria was not exactly the most technologically developed in comparison to the other powers, but it still had a very large population from which, if properly industrialized, would be quite effective. After initial industrial expansion, the next step after this would be to focus on the varying different elements within the country. Check steel in order to increase production here for guns, as this is one of the primary industrial heartlands of the empire. Urbanization of varying different regions, investing in Galicia, and from after that, actually being able to go down here and fix the poverty issue within Poland. And developing Hungarian aluminum along with electrifying the country. Every different element that is put towards industrialization and specifically tying elements of the country back to Austria itself is going to be crucial for this, building economic ties, political ties, and military ties all in one. The Agadir crisis begins. Yes, this is the whole issue with the French claims with Morocco, between them and Germany. A scenario that theoretically could have actually resulted in World War I if it had happened earlier. This is something that could have actually happened, which again is its own fascinating alternate history scenario. I've expressed that here before. But just as in our own timeline, ultimately this would pass, not result in anything, and we are going to have to wait a little bit longer for anything to happen. Dear Food Riots, the high prices of food, which are general in Europe owing to the drought, were the cause of great violence in the streets of Vienna this Sunday. A demonstration protest organized by the Socialists was attended in the afternoon by 50,000 rioters. General rioting followed when the meeting broke up and built barricades while fighting police forces. These riots caused 3 deaths and 170 arrests. We don't set the market prices. Yeah. That was going to be a constant issue with all the very different European powers, was socialist agitation. Vienna Parliament shooting. At a session at the Reichsrat in Vienna, 2 anarchists attempted to assassinate the Austrian Minister of Justice, Viktor von Hogenberger. After bringing a gun to the gallery, Nicholas Njegas fired 4 shots at the ministerial benches without injuring anyone. Faced with palpable social tensions, Minister-President Paul Gosch announces withdrawal in favor of Karl von Sturck. Yeah, I wish you luck. Yep, tensions are going to increase as time goes on. It is here then, perhaps, after industrial efforts at the middle point of 1911, that Austria-Hungary focuses well internal in order to try and quell as much dissent as possible. So to that end, this thing, politics. Austria is the political core of the empire. International decisions are always issued by Vienna. Strengthening the Triple Alliance must be our priority. Yes, this is going to increase relations specifically with Italy, with Germany, and try to maintain the status quo. From that then, it is time to launch into a severe anti-Serb policy. The Pig War was the culmination of the deterioration of relations between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. Since it is no longer possible to get closer to them, we just have to launch a demonization campaign against them, specifically seeking to isolate Serbia from other entities and also to crack down on any Serbian, Bosnian, and other nationalist forces that existed within the Balkans. Karl I's wedding. Hey, Karl has just married Zita de Bourbon-Parma, daughter of the Duke of Parma. The wedding took place in Austria in the presence of Franz Josef, who was very enthusiastic. Yay. Yeah, that is actually the younger brother of Franz Ferdinand, who was the actual heir to the throne once, the whole thing happened with Archduke Ferdinand and him getting assassinated. Interestingly enough, in this mod, he is a person that if you actually have him take control of things and fix stuff, you get some options that are very fascinating. You have different political paths, whether you get Franz Ferdinand actually in charge of the empire, or if you get Karl in charge of the empire, with Karl going in here actually having the option of being able to federalize the empire, which theoretically, and I'm bit of a spoiler here right now, that is something that if Franz Ferdinand had survived, is something that probably would have happened. The alternate paths of what would happen with either one being able to take charge and actually fix things within the empire is fascinating, and we're going to be addressing that as time goes on. You will see what I'm talking about. With that, my friends, we have the movement to end Slav opposition. In Bosnia, small groups are actively fighting the regime and threatening the stability of Illyria. We need to increase garrisons and provide police forces with the tools to hunt down Serbian-backed pro-independence criminals. This will replace South Slavic terrorists with fight against Serbian terrorism for a duration of 720 days. If you do not do this 2 years prior to the assassination, Franz Ferdinand will die. As such, it's imperative that rather than focus on industrial or army efforts, that Austria-Hungary focuses more on internal solutions first. As such, in order to support those efforts, what we're going to need to do now is rapidly industrialize and militarize our states. With control over Hungary, this means that more military efforts are going to be placed not just within concentrated Bohemia, but within the empire proper, so that stability can be maintained, and also partisans in other entities or parts of the empire cannot get any ideas. This thing. To witness strong social unrest in Austria-Hungary, especially in the manufacturing mining industries, workers went on strike to protest harsh working conditions, low wages, and health and safety hazards. The situation has become increasingly tense, with clashes between police and workers, as well as significant property damage in factories and businesses. In response to these events, the government decided to take measures to improve working conditions of workers. A social reform was worked out, which culminated in the labor law. This law, which limits daily working time to 11 hours a day. Wow. Fantastic, and sets standards for workplace safety and the protection of workers' health, is currently being discussed in Parliament. Yeah, while it is that we could say go on strike, which might be a historical option, we will say that no, this passes, that specifically the workers within the empire are more protected, and that even if this, to a degree, goes and affects industrial output, simultaneously is better than strikes, which historically would wreak havoc upon Austria's industry, much in the same way as they did upon Russian. With the completion of End Slav opposition, we then get the option of Balkan expansion, which historically, this this is something that Austria-Hungary wanted to do, but what we are going to say in this timeline is that no, they don't do this. They focus more on things internally, which allows for greater developments and simultaneously less opposition from their own internal minority populations. So no, that is actually not going to be done. Instead, the Czechs will be first brought to heel, and then afterwards, the Polish, the Bosnians, and the Italians will be dealt with. With the completion of our focus of Cisleithania Galicia, the issue that we are going to face here is the constant poverty that racks the region. The integration of Galicia, the Slavic area in the east, will only be possible by making real national efforts, starting with restoring the efficiency of local administration. Over the course of its history here, this was one of the poorest parts of the empire, which in order to be able to maintain the stability and make sure that this area doesn't come under threat by the Russians or even the Germans from that sense, the political support secured from Hungary is absolutely necessary. It means that we then have the ability to go in here and invest in regions in order to be able to strengthen ourselves. All of this is able to be done at once, which is further going to strengthen our hold over the area. Serbia got the shore. Our southern insular neighbor had, in their war of aggression, captured the Adriatic shore through the Albanian mountains. Their access to the sea would mean a lot of problems for us in the future. We can threaten them into retreating from the shore, and if stuff goes out of hand, we can easily just back off. Yeah, just like historically, we're going to send the demand, and from here, we're still going to show a degree of aggression, but still maintain things better than we did in our own time. At this point, with the rapidly approaching 1913, the most important thing for Austria-Hungary at this time is to rapidly industrialize itself as fast as possible. Theoretically, with greater control over its population, this means that it is going to have better output than it did in our own timeline. With the fighting of Bosnian terrorism, the last steps that we're going to need here on the political side, at least for the time being, is to pacify Italian Tyrol, answer the Italian question, and then after that, reinstitute the Croatian, constitution? Yeah, that thing. Essentially, all the steps necessary in order to be able to pacify the country. A strong Italian minority is established in the Austrian Tyrol, the local population refuses the authority of the crown, it's time to crush that opposition. Although we are in a military alliance with Italy, clear oppositions remain in the delimitation of the border with Tyrol. In order to guarantee Italy's loyalty, we should take the lead and offer territorial compensation in the event of a major conflict. This is the focus that would grant Austria the option to be able to offer territory to Italy in order to be able to secure their alliance. Historically speaking, this did not happen, and by that logic, we are also not going to do that as well. Theoretically, this does present an interesting option of what if everything had gone the same way that it did in World War I, but Austria had gone and provided territory to Italy. What if they had gotten Italy on their side? In this case, though, we don't have that option, as the only thing that we are really changing is the internal politics of Austria and also the avoiding of the assassination. Austria-Hungary and Italy are officially allies. However, we should be aware that Italian policy has focused on neutrality. It is possible that in the event of war, the government of Rome will decide to remain neutral, breaking the alliance and diminishing the effectiveness of the Central Powers. In order to strengthen our alliance, we could offer Italy some of our territories as an exceptional gift. If Austria was planning for a more offensive war and they were behaving smarter about things, then yes, theoretically, it is possible that they would go ahead and do this. However, because Austria is focusing more internally and not trying to actually take everything out in the Balkans, it makes sense that instead they would not do this. Instead, as the middle of 1913 rolls around, it is here at this point that the great question that has to be answered is the question of the military. Now, what we are going to say, and I'm not going to cheat in order to make this happen, is that the army has possibly been in the process of reforming for the past several years, and this is something that due to the greater ties that people perhaps have to the Austrian state and less ethnic tensions, arguably so, this means that the military is going to perform better. The subject of the army became political when Hungarian officers demanded that their language become a standard within the Hungarian corps. Currently, the command is only in German. This crisis has totally immobilized any reform because of the constant blockage posed by this leading question. We can make the argument that because the internal state has already been stabilized, that the Hungarians have been pacified, that from this, Franz Josef does not have to step down, just as he historically did not have to either. The army question crisis. A crisis crosses the empire. The Hungarian parliament inflicts great pressure on us, demanding a reform of the army in favor of Hungary. They ask for a chain of command in Hungarian. This demand is supported by the 48 Coalition, a nationalist group, which ultimately in here lost the election. This demand is supported by the 48 Coalition, a nationalist group. Opposed to such reform, Emperor Franz Josef announced that if the Hungarians pursued their demands, he would abdicate and place Franz Ferdinand in his place. Franz Ferdinand is known to hate Hungarians and would absolutely not help the affairs of the nationalists. Yes, this is actually an alternate history that theoretically we could go down and would be fascinating if we went and did this. There is a whole alternate history path of the Archduke still getting assassinated and it being his younger brother, Karl, the one who actually takes charge after he gets assassinated. Still, because of the internal issues that we've already resolved, we're going to say that the coalition gives up, that this does not happen. Instead, it unlocks the military focus tree, which in turn allows us to begin to reinforce the gemeinsame Armee. The army's chain of command is sorely lacking in communication, with a static and poorly understood hierarchy of orders. We must simplify the transmission of orders from the general to the soldier. Yeah, at this point, we can start fixing the multi-ethnic army issue. After this, organizing the artillery brigades, frontline and backline troops coordination is poor, sometimes causing friendly fire, or supporting strikes that are late or inaccurate. Yeah, this is a problem with Austria-Hungary throughout its history, where at different points, they would attack their own forces because they spoke different languages and would be in different uniforms. It was very messy. It is necessary to better plan the offensive by systemically communicating the main battle plan to the rear line brigades. Franz Ferdinand visited the United Kingdom. Franz Ferdinand is currently visiting Great Britain with his relatives. The heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary met Herbert Henry Asquith, then the Duke of Portland in Nottinghamshire. Duke Titchfield and Franz then started a gun shooting competition. However, mishandling of the weapons, placed at a distance and still loaded, caused a shot to be fired in the direction of the Archduke and his host. Yeah, God, dear God, this guy has no luck whatsoever, it seems. Except for what we're doing. So, with the aftermath of the Second Balkan War, here it is then that we are entering into 1914, or preparing. The world is safer, actually. At least much safer than it was in our own timeline. But that is really only under the surface. The threats, everything else are still going to take place. Situation in northern Epirus. The situation in the Balkans is very difficult for the Ottomans. Serbia and Greece have been liberated, Albania, and occupy the whole of their autonomous territory of the Sublime Porte. We must contain Greek expansionism in the region. The army of Athens has seized northern Epirus, a territory in which the Albanians live. We should impose on them the independence of this liberated region. Yes. What we'll do is claim Albanian independence. This is something that is going to create more hostility, yes, and is the historical timeline, but it's what needs to happen. Just as in our own timeline, Greece would yield northern Epirus. And oh crap, I actually just missed it here. I was supposed to react to that. Well, we survived the assassination attempt. That happened. So, no July crisis. Damn, I really wish that I could have actually read that aloud here. Well, it worked. So the big question is then, what happens next? I mean, there's no July crisis, no war breaks out between Austria and Serbia, which means that Russia never gets drawn in, and nothing happens. World War I is over and everyone is saved, right? Well, probably not. The great powers at this point in history were itching for a fight. There was a lot of bad blood between France and Germany over Alsace-Lorraine and the Franco-Prussian War that established the German Empire in the first place. Russia was not liking what was happening down here in the Balkans with Austria-Hungary, and simultaneously, one of the big things, Austria-Hungary and elements within the German Empire wanted to knock out the Russians before it is that they would be able to go and industrialize and be an even bigger threat. There were nationalistic elements within all these varying entities that could have easily triggered a war. As it turns out, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was actually one of the people who was staunchly against a war, and specifically did not want anything to happen. With no immediate breaking out of any conflict, this means that Austria-Hungary has more time to be able to gather itself, to reform itself, to build up its military, build up its forces, and simultaneously industrialize itself further, to increase its internal stability. Ethnic battalions would be created. We must group battalions according to their ethnicities and languages in order to strengthen group cohesion and solidarity within the same ensemble. At this point, we just have to wonder, what is going to happen next? Is 1914 rolls into 1915? Nothing has actually happened. Oh, and here we have it. A full year after events were actually supposed to take place, the French Republic goes and declares war on the German Empire. This is fascinating here, because in this alternate scenario that we have built, France and Germany, which were always ready to go to war with one another, a lot of people in history like to remember that, oh, Germany just wanted to attack France. No, they all wanted to attack each other. They really did. Many elements within France specifically wanted revenge for the German victory back during the Franco-Prussian War, and specifically want to take back the Alsace-Lorraine territory. Funnily enough, now because this is a defensive war for the Central Powers, Germany is guaranteed by Italy. This is part of the thing. This is part of the alliance that they had, meaning Italy is actually obligated in this new timeline to come to the defense of the Central Powers. Yes, not join in on any offensive action as they didn't want to partake in such a war, but in this case, in a defensive alliance, France is in a significantly worse position than it would be in our own time. So begins the Great War. Now, at this point in time, Austria would be part of the Central Powers, and though they would not necessarily want to go to war, at least if it was under the directorship of Franz Ferdinand, currently Franz Joseph is still in charge, meaning, of course, Austria is going to come to the defense of its allies, and from this, perhaps gain additional territories after it has spent a solid 5 years centralizing its control in varying territories. So yes, we join in. Additional war support is generated as now we of course are coming to the defense of our allies. And the Russians, even though they have an additional year to be able to prepare in this time period, are still under a constant threat of revolution. The state is not exactly going to strengthen itself at this time. It would need not just 1 or 2 years, but maybe 5 or 10 years past the point where the war started to be in any kind of strong position. Immediately after this, conscription is raised, additional forces are prepared to be brought into the front lines. Considering these actions, it means that Austria-Hungary does not have to dedicate nearly as many forces to the southern front. Italy will actually protect against France, and then simultaneously from that, they only need to make make sure to guard the southern border and then afterwards focus entirely on Russia. This means that from the very get-go of the war, significantly more forces are able to be dedicated to the Eastern Front, which theoretically should result in us being able to knock out the troops much faster. Theoretically, one of the things that could also have happened during this time is that there could have been an uprising from varying different Polish peoples. This was something that was always a risk with Russia, and from that, you could have had German and Austrian elements wanting to work with different Polish elements in order to be able to weaken Russia from the inside out. There's really an infinite number of possibilities for what could have caused the war and then led to the events that we are now seeing. Now, the only thing that we are seeing here in this game that likely would not have happened from the scenario is the, events that would occur here in Belgium. One of the key issues that happened over the course of World War I, or rather from the beginning, is that the Schlieffen Plan that the Germans launched, specifically through Belgium, is what ended up causing the British to go and join in on the conflict. Now, there is a real chance that the Germans would have, or not Germans, that the British would have actually joined in on the conflict, but later. There was no reason for them to join in the very beginning as they did, but this happened specifically because of, Belgium. So while I wish that I could have stopped this here, unfortunately that's just one of the limitations of the game. There is no reason for the German Empire to really focus on doing that, considering that with the Italian front now secure, I said secure, but it's no longer really secure. Well, we're gonna need more units and also national mobilization. The new conflict requires us to accelerate the restructuring of the army. We must combine this action with national propaganda urging local ethnic groups to put their differences aside for the supreme good of the nation. Yes, indeed. Well, either way, with the Italian front not exactly held, but simultaneously at least not in as weak of a position as it theoretically could be, this means that more attention, at least for a while, can be focused specifically upon Russia. Within the span of just a few months, Warsaw is likely to fall, spelling a massive blow for the Russians, trapping potentially tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of men. Serbian ultimatum. While we are facing a very difficult war, we have just received an ultimatum from Serbia. It demands the cessation of Bosnia and all Banat and Croatia. These terms are absolutely delusional, and it seems obvious that Serbia is taking advantage of our war to steal a large part of our territory. Yes, in the event that a war does not break out, it would make sense that nationalist groups from within Serbia would specifically want to push for, war. There is no reason for a stronger Austria-Hungary to give in to these demands, and so no, that is not going to happen. To hell with them. And just look at that. Within the span of just a couple months, it is October of 1915, the war began in July. This is 3, 22, 24, 27, 28, 29, 35, 43, 45, 46, 47, 55, 56, 57, 83. That is 83 divisions that we have managed to trap in a massive blow. The entirety of the Russian force is 203 to 296, meaning that is a third of the entire army is now trapped. Potentially almost half, depending upon the numbers. Serbia has gone and declared war. How lovely. Oh, and look, there's even more divisions that are trapped over on this side. Yeah, those are massive, massive wipeouts of forces. Black Sea Raid, German warships recently transferred the Ottoman nationality, suddenly raided Russian ports. Yes, there's a very real possibility, considering the rivalry between the Ottomans and the Russians, that the Ottomans would take a chance here to be able to go and invade the Russians, which, after the massive losses they'd be facing on the Eastern Front, could result in significantly more damage than it did in our own timeline. Because of the split attention, this means that France would be in a more vulnerable position. Yes, the Italians were not exactly the best militarily, which means that the French are likely to be able to push in somewhat through the mountains, but it will become a situation very similar to what happened with Italy versus the Austrians, where although they made some gains, they were not able to push very far, and simultaneously, this allows Germany to be able to push deeper into the west. The major focus is in the east, though. Eventually it is seeing an opportunity that perhaps Bulgaria would go and join the Central Powers just as they did in our own timeline. Serbia likely would have been able to hold out even after the declaration of war against Austria-Hungary, specifically because the majority of forces would have been concentrated on the Russian front before it is that they could move down south. However, with the joining in of Bulgaria, this would very quickly allow the entirety of Serbia to become overrun. Theoretically, within a year, Russia, with significantly more forces arrayed against them, is going to be utterly crushed. Defeat after defeat after defeat is going to happen, which in turn means that the Tsar is likely to take power significantly earlier, which in turn means that the revolution is going to occur. Russian autocracy collapses as revolution forces the Tsar to abdicate. In a desperate bid to try and relieve pressure from the Russians, this means that the Salonika front would be launched out of Greece. Now, even with these gains being made, it is possible that Russia... Now, the thing is, there is a chance, perhaps, that Romania, just as we can see here, would go and join the Entente, just as they did in our own timeline. Historically, the reason they did this is because they wanted to lay claim over Transylvania and the historically Romanian population that would be there, and simultaneously, they were promised much aid from the Entente. However, in this timeline in which France, Britain, and Russia are significantly harder pressed, and Italy is not part of the Entente, it decreases the likelihood that Romania would join in, but there is a chance that with the other powers distracted, that forces from the UK and France would be able to flood into Romania and be able to help from that side. Historically, the result of this was that in 1917, Romania was defeated. Theoretically, with significantly more forces to the east, this would result in the same thing, except at a much faster rate. I mean, dear God, they don't even have enough troops to cover their border here. We're just gonna walk right into them. Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, within the span of a couple months, Romania collapses. Calculating peace. Russia has capitulated. Theoretically, with the sheer amount of forces that are able to be dedicated to the east, by virtue of the fact that Italy is on the side of the Central Powers and is able to guard the south, this means that with a much greater and cohesive Austria-Hungary, simultaneously, the Russians never have a chance to even break out into Marxist revolution. Instead, they just collapse and sue for peace, giving the Germans everything it is that they want. This all by August of 1916, which, if you remember from our time frame, is a little over a year into the conflict. This would be the equivalent, again, if by, say, August of 1915, this had happened. A full whopping 2 years before it did in our own time frame. This in turn means that with their vast amount of experience, that these forces from the east are able to be sent west. This time, though, flooding both front lines. With German reinforcements flooding the front line of the Western Front, and with Austrian forces flooding the front line within Italy, this means that the Allies are steadily about to be pushed back. Still, in 1916, Franz Joseph would die. This in turn would result in the rise of Franz Ferdinand as the leader of Austria-Hungary. There's a chance that Austria-Hungary has to take a step back for a while and not participate nearly as much in the conflict for the next couple months, while it is that they get themselves politically organized. As voices of dissent rise within the empire, naturally the first step would be specifically for the emperor to crush Hungarian nationalism. The Hungarians and their half in the empire crave the rights the German-Austrian half does. It would not hurt to give them what they want, especially if it would result in the goodwill that was spent later. Yes, although Franz Ferdinand certainly did not like the Hungarians, the reason as to why he would want to give them all rights, as we explain in here, is specifically because he wanted to weaken the Hungarian nobility. By giving rights to the common people, this would weaken the Hungarian nobles' power, the people that he strongly disliked. As Franz Ferdinand comes into power, one thing that one has to understand is that he was significantly more, well, liberal-minded, I guess, than his predecessors. He wanted to adopt a number of political and economic reforms, one of which was opening the country to more foreign investment and actually liberalizing things. If we had gone down the alternate history path of the previous emperor going and abdicating in favor of Franz Ferdinand earlier in our timeline, so not waiting for war to actually break out, this meant that we would have been able to go down the liberalizing path here earlier, and then from that, possibly completely cut German ties or retie ourselves to it. It really depends on how things actually break out. With Austria-Hungary even then having the ability to align itself with the Entente, that is something that theoretically could have happened if the previous generation was not actually in charge. So yeah, fruits of the open door. The Emperor's connections will allow us to establish contracts with large companies at greatly reduced prices. This opportunity could allow us to catch up on the industrial level of some of the other great powers. However, we must be careful not to become too dependent on lobbies, which, yes, that is a very real possibility of corruption developing here within the state. Now, despite greater cohesion, there is still a very real risk that as the war goes on, there is going to be significantly more problems within the state. Austria-Hungary was, after all, not necessarily very well developed, and so this is still going to be occurring. Food protests within Hungary. A series of demonstrations shook the country, particularly in Hungary, organized mainly by women, revolted by the rationing in force all in regions of the empire. They demonstrated the absence of support for the war from part of the population. Slogans were chanted calling for an end to the fighting and an end to the dual monarchy. We must censor it. Victory within the Balkans would drastically free up resources, which in turn mean less trouble. Eventually, the number of the Austro-Hungarians combined with the Italians would be able to push back Entente forces even through their more defensible positions. Casualties would be horrendous, but this is where the Entente would start to lose ground. In an effort to slow this down, this is when the Great Arab Revolt would likely trigger, specifically trying to weaken the Ottoman Empire from the inside out in order to be able to distract the Central Power forces. As the Entente is gradually pushed back, this in turn is where events are likely to take place that may change the tide of the war, or at least send it into an entirely new era. First off, with vastly less support for the Thessaloniki front, this means that the Bulgarians would not collapse. Instead, they are likely to take out any of the Greek elements that were trying to support the Entente. On top of that, the sinking of the Lusitania would in turn likely draw the Americans into the conflict. Gradually, as 1917 begins to head into 1918, this is where things truly would begin to shift. If America has not joined in on the conflict by this point, then it means that France, who is now pressed on two sides, would gradually begin to fall. It would fight tooth and nail for every single square inch, but with both the combined forces of Italy and Austria-Hungary able to push in, and with German forces fresh from the Eastern Front being able to flood through the West, as they have been for the previous year and a half at this point, it means that the French forces would not be able to take their men off of the front line. Gradually, a combined Italo-Austro-Hungarian front would be able to push through the south. Still, should fighting extend even further, famine would become an epidemic, on top of the sickness that was already spreading along the front lines affecting everyone. The Central Powers were already in a rougher position, and theoretically with the Italians there would be greater trade. However, that does not mean that the fertilizer and everything that is necessary for the Central Powers would able to be obtained. Both sides would see 1917 heading into 1918 as a desperate time to get anything possible done. To that end, necessary steps moving into the French countryside would have to be made. Pillaging would have to take place, wreaking havoc amongst the population, but in turn feeding the supplies of the German and Hungarian forces. Any and all effort would have to be made to invest into the countryside to try and produce as much as possible, and theoretically, in this time, it may be more possible, specifically because, well, the war has gone better for the Central Powers. With significantly less support from the Entente, this means that the Ottoman Empire is actually able to deal with its problems and simultaneously send additional forces in order to be able to crush the Greeks. As southern France falls, a last-ditch effort is made to try to hold the line. So it is, heading into mid to late 1918, just as the war was winding down on our side. The Austrians and Germans and French, with forces mass deserting from every army, desperate to end the conflict, finally they are right outside the gates of Paris itself. Until finally, potentially by our own time, like when it would normally occur, the Entente surrenders. France falls. Victory for the Kaiserreich. The cost of war, though, absolutely horrendous. Millions dead. Mass starvation, mutinies, desertion, an epidemic. Gradually, this tears apart the entire force. But peace is eventually signed. Germany, the Central Powers, are victorious. France and her allies will have to pay the price demanded by the victors in the post-war treaty. The results of which, mass demilitarization, a farm crisis taking place, and the very fragile Austria-Hungary now having to figure out what needs to be done. In the aftermath of the war, South Africa collapses. Other entities of the British colonial empire, such as the British Raj, also collapse. France, unhappy with its forces being demilitarized, denounce any army restrictions upon them, increasing further possibility of greater hostility. As the former British Empire now tears itself apart in the aftermath of the war, and the French Empire gradually becomes more and more destabilized, Austria-Hungary's position becomes something of a question. It had wished to open itself up, but after suffering so many problems, even the internal reforms that Franz Ferdinand had put in place would likely not necessarily be able to maintain the status quo for long. Too many people had died, too many had suffered, and loyalty was not firm in this time. It would make sense that Austria-Hungary would gradually begin to dissolve into its more federalized system that Franz Ferdinand had wanted in the first place. Serbia, though it's not represented in here at all, would likely be a puppet of Austria-Hungary, much in the same way as Montenegro and Albania are. Romania, which in this game here was released as an independent state, would also likely be a puppet of Austria-Hungary, as its forces within the Balkans would be cemented, and Ukraine would be placed under its tutelage. For Germany, as the victor, war would be long and hard, but it would be able to establish a series of puppet states, such as Flanders-Wallonia and others, which in turn would allow it to maintain its own borders and stability. For Italy's participation in the conflict, though they would not gain any territory from Austria-Hungary, they would be able to expand themselves, taking over parts of France, such as in Savoy. The gains from this time would not necessarily be great, particularly for the losses that Italy suffered over the course of the war, which come from the time of the Second War, which inevitably is likely to break out considering the circumstances, much as you see in the Kaiser Redux mod. Italy would likely face its own internal either fascist or communist upheavals, which would more than likely in the end side with France, which would see its own rise in socialist communist ideology. The world of Kaiser Redux is likely then created as a result of this, except in this case, there will be more of a stronger socialist element, with likely instead of a divided Italy, it being a united force, which would lead to a greater communist uprising amongst the three powers, both from England, from France, from Italy, which could potentially create more trouble with a possible resurgence of Soviet Russia if that happens, which would send the entire world plummeting into ideological war. The world is not a clean place in this sense. Either way, my friends, that is the end of today's video. We've taken this on for actually quite a long time. This has been way longer than I ever thought would actually happen, and that was incredibly brutal to try and create. The limitations of the game meant that I couldn't do as much as I wanted to tell certain parts of the story, and we kind of had to roll around and see what would happen in the game if we did certain things. Either way, I think that is the end of today's video. Thank you all very much for watching. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, and also make sure to put the comments of what you think the next alternate history suggestion should be down in the comment section below, and make sure to vote for that. My friends, thank you all very much for watching. Make sure to go and check out my merch as well as coffee and everything else, which I have links for down in the description. It's a great way to support the channel, and I'll see you all here next time. Goodbye, guys.